Good afternoon, students. This is Mr. Burns coming from the basement lab. I'll try to sit still on my chair because it's pretty squeaky. But we're going to continue our lessons on women's history. On this one, maybe because women were often so powerless in American society in its early years, they were often involved in reform movements. And I have 4 important reform movements listed. Let's see if I can grab a pencil. Let's grab this pretty color here. The first one is the temperance movement. And the temperance movement was all about getting the sale and manufacturing of alcohol to stop, because alcoholism was a big problem in our country for most of its history. The next one that I have listed there is the anti-slavery movement. The last one I have is the prison reform movement. And the one that I'm going to circle now is women's suffrage. Women's suffrage. Suffrage is a big, complicated word, and it just means the right to vote. And really the weird thing there is that the drive to get the vote for women happened because of the anti-slavery movement. Women got involved in the anti-slavery movement, and they were treated poorly by men, and this caused them to know that, hey, we need political power, and we won't have political power unless we get the vote for ourselves. So let's take a look at some of these important reform movements. So starting out here, we have Angelina Grimke. And Angelina Grimke was very important to the anti-slavery movement. One of the really interesting things about her is that Angelina and her sister, they grew up on a plantation in South Carolina. So they were from a very wealthy family, and she knew what the real story for what life was like for a slave, because she witnessed it firsthand on their plantation. Angelina and her sister would go on to become Quakers, and it was through their connection with the Quaker church that they became public speakers. Okay, so here's the other sister. We have Angelina and Sarah Grimke. After they left the South, they went to Philadelphia and they became Quakers. And as part of their faith, they also took part in public meetings, and they began to speak out about the evils of slavery. And they would like to say that, in the North, actually, come on, give me that. Ooh, weird. Yeah, let me circle this. There was a lot of Southern, we call it propaganda. So the South put out a lot of messages and a lot of stories and a lot of newspaper articles that slaves had it pretty good on those plantations. They would say that it was always sunny and they had plenty of food to eat and they were treated well by their masters. And this was a lot of propaganda. Propaganda means that there was really not a lot of truth to it. So the Grimke sisters, Angelina, could give eyewitness testimony to the violence on a plantation. And what do I mean by violence? Well, if a slave disobeyed a master, a slave could be whipped and beaten. If a slave ran away, sometimes the master would clip toes off of their feet, and this would make it very difficult to run. To show that a slave was property, sometimes they were branded, and this helped masters identify them if they were to run away, the brands and the scars that they had on their arm. And of course, if the master ran short of money, one of the cruelest things of all is that he could tear a slave family apart, and he could sell the women or the men or the children away from each other. So they were very effective out on the public speaking circuit. Now, I should circle one last thing on this page before we move on, and that is they also wanted equality for women. The reason they wanted equality for women is that they were widely criticized sometimes for getting up in public forums and speaking about the evils of slavery, because the custom of the day was that audiences were not mixed, and you should never have a woman getting up and speaking in front of an audience of men. So these two women, Angelina and Sarah Grimke, really saw the ridiculousness in that. And one of the other things that they believed in is that women should be equal to men. So here we have a picture of Angelina speaking. She was the speaker. Sarah did more of the writing. One of the remarkable firsts is that in 1838, Angelina gets up in front of the Massachusetts state legislature and gives her little speech about the evils of slavery. Now, she was criticized for this, like I said before, because she was a woman and she was speaking in front of an audience of men. And the customs of the day said that this was kind of a no-no. So in addition to being anti-slavery crusaders, the Grimke sisters also wanted equal rights for women. One of the other important reform movements that women spearheaded was in how the mentally ill were treated in the 1800s. For most of the 1800s, treatment was really cruel. And if you zoom in on all those pictures that you see off to the left, you really see, the sick person who can't help it. They have this disorder in their brain, or they have this depression that keeps them from functioning correctly. The way they handled those people, the way they controlled those people, were to lock them in jails. They didn't give them medical treatment. You see the one woman has got her fist raised and she's going to administer a beating to the young girl. You see in the upper left-hand corner, she has her down on the ground and she's pulling her hair like you could beat the mental illness out of a person. So it was really common if you walk through one of these horrible hospitals, it's going to be dark and dirty, and you're probably going to see the patients chained up. So abuse was very common and the food was very poor. So this was a terrible way to treat somebody who was sick. But those were the customs of the day. Here you see another really good picture of what it probably looked like if you were to walk through a hospital for the mentally ill. And you see the patients being shackled to the walls, so they're tied to the walls with chains. You see that man, he's throwing a bucket, and that's either his food or excrement. So it could be very dirty and very filthy places. But there's no medical treatment going on in there. So the important person who was involved in this reform movement is Dorothea Dix. And she starts out her critical work in the 1840s. And this is going to go on for some time. I mean, you stop and think about it. We still have stigmas about mental illness in our own society. So Dorothea Dix, she works for cleaning up some of these hospitals for the mentally ill. They were called insane asylums. So she's working to clean them up and get people treated better. And it was, like I said, very important work. These were terrible, cruel places where the sick, they're not getting any help for their mental illnesses. So here's our last picture here, and that's just a picture of Dorothea Dix. And the thing to know about her is she is working for the country's better treatment of the mentally ill. So the three women we learned about in this lesson are Dorothea Dix, working for the better treatment of the mentally ill. And then we had Angelina and Sarah Grimke. They were abolitionists, and they were also women's rights workers. They wanted to see slavery abolished, and they wanted to see women get equality to men, and mainly the way they wanted to see equality come with men is through the vote.